The Bible is the best-selling text of all time, but a new discovery may put a new twist on an old story. That's because an uncovered text that's 1,500 years in the making has Bible scholars extremely excited.
We assume the Bible has always looked the way it does today, but a massive discovery in Rome just proved that theory wrong. A researcher named Grigory Kessel found a ghost text hovering behind the visible letters of an ancient manuscript.
Grigory Kessel discovered a hidden text in the Syriac language going as far back as the early 6th century.
It is a lost translation of the Gospel of Matthew, and it has been invisible for centuries. This text does not just add a few words, it changes the scene entirely. It makes you wonder what else is hiding in the dark corners of history, waiting for the right light to reveal it. The 1,000-year secret. You see, back in the medieval period, paper did not exist. People wrote on parchment, which was made from animal skins. It was incredibly expensive. We are talking about the skin of a whole goat or sheep just to make a couple of pages. So if you were a scribe in the desert and you ran out of material, you did not just run to the store. You took an old book, scraped off the ink with a knife, and wrote something new on top of it. This is called a palimpsest. It is basically the ancient version of recycling, but the crazy part is that the ink never truly disappears. It leaves a chemical footprint deep in the fibers of the animal skin. For centuries, this manuscript sat on a shelf. To the naked eye, it just looked like a collection of Georgian writings from a much later period. But Kessel suspected there was something beneath the surface. He used a technique called ultraviolet fluorescence photography. It sounds complicated, but it is actually pretty simple. The old ink reflects light differently than the parchment and the new ink. When you hit it with the right wavelength, the bottom layer glows. Suddenly, words that had been invisible for over a millennium popped out in bright white against the dark background. It was like a message from the grave. This specific manuscript had been erased not once, but twice. It started as the old Syriac gospel in the 6th century. Then, a few hundred years later, a scribe scraped it clean to write a Greek text. Then, centuries after that, another scribe erased the Greek to write a Georgian text. It is like a layer cake of history, with the most delicious part hidden right at the bottom. But why does this matter? Because the old Syriac translation is one of the rarest things on earth. Before this discovery, we only had 3 known manuscripts of this text. This is the 4th, and it contains details that were lost in later translations. The implications are massive. This text dates back to the 3rd century. That is at least a century older than the oldest Greek manuscripts we usually rely on, like the Codex Sinaiticus. It gives us a window into how the very early Christians understood their own holy book before hundreds of years of editing and politics changed things. The scientific community is buzzing because this proves that the Vatican secret archives and other libraries are full of these hidden texts. We are walking past lost history every single day without knowing it. It makes you wonder what else is hiding in those shelves, just waiting for someone to turn on the lights. But the biggest shock wasn't just the age of the text, it was what the text actually said. Rewriting the Holy Script. So here's where things get really interesting. You might be thinking that a few changed words do not matter, but in the world of ancient history and theology, a single word can change the fate of nations. The text that Kessel found contains a variation in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 1. In the standard Greek version that everyone uses today, the story goes that Jesus and his disciples were walking through a grain field on the Sabbath. The disciples were hungry, so they began to pick the heads of grain and eat them. The Pharisees saw this and got angry because doing any work on the Sabbath was forbidden. That is the story we all know. But the old Syriac version has a detail that defies the Canon. It says the disciples began to pick the heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat them. Now that phrase, rub them in their hands, might seem small to you, but historically it is a huge deal. It changes the legal accusation. In the ancient laws of the time, simply picking a fruit or a grain might not be considered work in the sense of harvesting, but rubbing the grain to separate the chaff, that is a manual labor process. That is threshing. By adding that specific detail, the old Syriac text raises the stakes of the confrontation. It makes the disciples look much more like they are breaking the hard laws of the Sabbath. This suggests that the early Syriac community had a different understanding of that event. Maybe they were more focused on the physical labor aspect. Or maybe this was the original description and later Greek translators removed the rubbing part to make the disciples look a little less guilty. It opens up a can of worms about how much the Bible has been polished over the centuries, and that is putting it lightly. We tend to think of these books as static, unchangeable objects, but discoveries like this show us that they were living documents, changing and shifting as they moved from language to language. The Old Syriac translation was done around the year 200 or 300. This is incredibly early. It means this text was being read while the Roman Empire was still persecuting Christians. It was being read before the official Bible canon was even fully solidified. The language itself, Syriac, is a dialect of Aramaic. And get this, Aramaic is the language that Jesus and his disciples actually spoke. So when you read the Greek Bible, you are reading a translation of what they said. But when you read the Old Syriac, you are reading a language that is like a cousin to the original words. It captures the rhythm and the flavor of the Middle East in a way that Greek or Latin never could. Scholars are calling this the missing link of textual history. It bridges the gap between the oral traditions of the apostles and the formalized books we have today. The fact that this specific detail about rubbing the grain exists here, but not in the later versions, suggests that the earliest stories were more raw, more detailed, and perhaps more controversial. It paints a picture of a group of men who were living rough, processing their own food by hand in the fields, not just casually snacking. It adds a layer of gritty realism that often gets smoothed over in religious art. But there is another layer to this mystery. Why was it erased? Was it just because the parchment was expensive? That is the official story. But some historians argue that texts were often erased because they fell out of favor. If a version of the Bible had words that the church leaders did not like, it was much easier to scrape them off and turn them into a prayer book or a list of saints. By recovering this text, we are essentially recovering a voice that was silenced, and the man who silenced it might be just as famous as the text itself. Hiding the truth forever. The person responsible for erasing this incredible text was likely a monk named Io von Zosime. Now, this guy is a legend in his own right. He lived in the 10th century and was based at the St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. This place is one of the oldest working monasteries in the world. It sits right at the foot of the mountain where Moses is said to have received the 10 Commandments. It is isolated, dry, and incredibly holy. Zosime was a prolific scribe. He wrote a lot. And to write a lot, he needed a lot of paper. Zosime moved from the Sinai to the Marsaba Monastery near Jerusalem, and he took his library with him. He was known for collecting texts and rewriting them. In this case, he took the manuscript that had the Old Syriac Matthew on it, which had already been covered by Greek, and he scraped it all down to write in Georgian. He was creating a new liturgical book, something for the daily church services. To him, the Old Syriac text was just outdated junk. It was an obsolete translation that nobody used anymore. Why keep an old version when everyone is reading the new standard version? It is easy to judge him today. We want to scream at him across history, "Stop, do not erase that," but you have to understand his reality. He did not have Amazon or a paper mill down the street. If he wanted to preserve the prayers and hymns of his own people, he had to sacrifice something else. It was a brutal trade-off. To save the present, he had to destroy the past. The irony is that by writing over it, he actually saved it. If this parchment had not been reused and kept in a safe library, it probably would have been thrown away or rotted in a cave somewhere. The layers of new ink acted like a protective seal, locking the old words safely underneath until we invented the technology to see them. The discovery highlights the importance of the St. Catherine's Monastery. It is famous for its collection of manuscripts. In fact, a huge number of the world's palimpsests come from there. It seems the monks there were very aggressive about recycling, but this also tells us something about the flow of information. This book traveled from Syria to Sinai to Jerusalem and eventually ended up in the Vatican. It crossed empires and war zones. It survived the rise of Islam, the Crusades, and the 2 world wars. It is a miracle that it exists at all. This brings up a massive point about what we call the Dark Ages. We usually think of that time as a period where knowledge was lost, but in reality, knowledge was being transformed. The monks were the gatekeepers. They decided what was worth keeping and what was worth scraping away. The fact that the old Syriac gospel was on the scraping list tells us that by the 10th century the church had moved on. They had standardized their texts. The unique details like the rubbing of the grain were no longer seen as necessary. They were just old, confused variations. But technology has turned the tables. We are no longer dependent on what Ioveni Zosime decided was important. We can look right through his work and see what he was standing on. This multispectral imaging technology is going to change everything. There are thousands of manuscripts in the Vatican, in London, in Paris, and in private collections that have never been tested. We estimate that a huge percentage of ancient parchments are palimpsests. We are literally sitting on a mountain of lost knowledge. Who knows what else Zosime erased? Maybe he erased a map. Maybe he erased a cure for a disease. Or maybe he erased a gospel that tells a completely different story of the end times. We are just scratching the surface of the Sinai Palimpsests project. This is a group of scientists dedicated to doing exactly what Kessel did. They are hunting through the archives of St. Catherine's Monastery digitally. They have already found lost medical texts from ancient Greece and astronomical data that was thought to be gone forever. This Syriac gospel is just the tip of the iceberg. It proves the method works. And that is what makes people nervous. Because if you can see what was erased, you might find things that people wanted to stay hidden for a reason. This leads us to a darker possibility that some experts are whispering about: unlocking the vault doors. Let's be real for a second. The Vatican Library is not your local public library. It is a fortress. They have 53 miles of shelving. Just think about that. 53 miles of books, scrolls, and documents. Most of it is completely accessible to scholars, but the sheer volume means that things get lost, or things get misplaced. The discovery of this Syriac gospel was not a conspiracy, it was a needle in a haystack situation. But it fuels the fire for everyone who believes the Vatican is holding back secrets. If a major text like a lost chapter of Matthew can sit there for hundreds of years without anyone knowing, what about the controversial stuff? We know there were other gospels. We found the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas in the desert sands of Egypt. These texts paint a very different picture of Jesus. Some of them are Gnostic, meaning they believe in secret knowledge and that the physical world is evil. The church spent centuries hunting these books down and burning them. They were considered dangerous viruses that could infect the minds of believers. The old Syriac gospel is not Gnostic, but it is different. And different scares institutions that rely on unity. When you have a text that says X and another text that says Y, you have a problem. You have to decide which one is true. For 1,000 years, the church worked hard to make sure everyone was reading the same page. Discoveries like this throw a wrench in the gears. They show that early Christianity was a wild, diverse, and sometimes chaotic movement. There wasn't just one Bible. There were many. And the one we have today is the survivor of a cage match between all these different versions. This discovery also links to the famous Peshitta, which is the standard Bible for the Syriac churches today. But the old Syriac is the grandfather of the Peshitta. It is rougher, less polished. It shows the evolution of theology. It is like looking at the rough draft of the Constitution versus the final copy. You can see the edits. You can see what they took out. And usually what people take out is just as important as what they leave in. Everyone is obsessed with the idea of a smoking gun document, something that proves or disproves a major dogma. While the rubbing of the grain is a detail, it is not a theology breaker, but the potential is there. If we apply this UV light to every single manuscript in the Vatican, we are mathematically guaranteed to find something that is going to upset someone. Maybe we find a letter from an apostle that contradicts Paul. Maybe we find a record of a historical event that the church denied happened. The technology is neutral, but the results are not. Grigory Kessel's find is a victory for science, but it is a headache for traditionalists. It blurs the lines. It reminds us that the Bible did not drop out of the sky in English with a leather binding. It was copied by hand, by tired monks, by candlelight on recycled goatskin over centuries of war and famine. Mistakes happened, edits happened, and purposeful censorship happened. The old Syriac gospel is a survivor of all three. The scholarly world is now scrambling to check other Georgian manuscripts. If Giovanni Zosime erased one gospel, he probably erased others. He was a creature of habit. There could be a whole library of lost Christian history hiding under the liturgical chants of the 10th century. It is the ultimate irony. The prayers sung by the monks were written on the corpses of the scriptures they were praying to. But what if the erasing wasn't just about saving paper? What if there is a pattern to what was removed? The final revelation. Now let's get into the wild territory. We have to ask the big question, why was this text erased? We are told it was just about recycling paper. We are told parchment was expensive, so Zosime the scribe scraped off the old ink to save money. But what if that is just the cover story? What if the old Syriac texts were erased systematically because they contained a timeline or a genealogy that did not fit the narrative the Byzantine Church wanted to push? Think about the time period. This was the Dark Ages. The Church was fighting to keep control. They were trying to unify an empire under one specific story. If you have a text that contradicts that story, you don't just burn it, because burning draws attention. You erase it. You bury it. Some alternative theorists believe that the early Syriac Church had a connection to the East, to India and China, that the Western Church wanted to cut off completely. We know Thomas the Apostle supposedly went to India. There are ancient churches there that claim to be founded by him. But the Western Bible focuses almost entirely on the Mediterranean, Rome, Greece, Jerusalem. It ignores the East. If the old Syriac Gospels contain stories of Jesus' teachings that leaned more towards Eastern philosophy, that would be a major reason to scrape them off the face of the earth. Imagine if this text contained the lost years. You know what I'm talking about. In the Bible we have today, Jesus is a baby, then he is a 12-year-old boy in the temple, and then poof, he vanishes. He doesn't show up again until he is 30 years old. That is an 18-year gap, 18 years of silence. Where was he? What was he doing? There are legends that he traveled the Silk Road, that he learned from mystics in the Himalayas. If this old Syriac text fills in those 18 years, and if it shows Jesus learning from cultures that Rome considered pagan or barbarian, the church would have panicked. They couldn't have their Messiah learning from someone else. He had to be the source of all wisdom, not a student. So Zosime scrapes the page. He erases the journey. He resets the timeline to fit the Roman mold, and it gets deeper. Think about the specific detail Grigory Kessel found. The disciples rubbing the grain in their hands. It seems like a small thing, right? But in the detective world of history, the small things are the smoking guns. This detail emphasizes the physical, the earthly labor. It is gritty. It is real. Back then, there were groups called Gnostics. They tried to say Jesus was a spirit, a hologram, not a real man of flesh and blood. A text that emphasizes the gritty reality of rubbing grain and eating chaff fights against that idea. But what if it went too far the other way? What if there are missing passages in these erased layers that show Jesus as too human? That would be the ultimate heresy for a church trying to establish his absolute divinity. If this text showed him getting sick or being tired or admitting he didn't know the answer to a question, that is dangerous data. Erasing those words would be a holy duty for a scribe like Zosime. He wasn't just cleaning paper, he was sanitizing God. There is also the time capsule theory. This is where it gets really cinematic. Some people believe that scribes like Zosime knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't destroying the text out of malice, they were hiding it. Think about it like a spy movie. You have a document that the authorities want to destroy. If you leave it on a shelf, they burn the library. If you hide it under a rock, the damp destroys it. So what do? You hide it in plain sight. You turn it into a palimpsest. You write a boring, safe, standard prayer book on top of it. Essentially, you are smuggling the forbidden text through time. It is the perfect camouflage. Nobody burns a prayer book. Nobody looks twice at a collection of standard hymns. By burying the controversial text inside a safe text, they ensured it would survive until a time when people could handle the truth. It's like digital encryption, but with ink. Zosime might have been a hero. He might have been preserving the original code of Christianity, waiting for us to invent the technology like UV blue light to finally unlock it. And get this, there is a lot of talk about the missing key of language. The old Syriac language uses idioms and phrases that make zero sense when you translate them directly into Greek. We have to remember, Jesus didn't speak Greek, he spoke Aramaic. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. That means this text is closer to the source than almost anything else we have. There are theories that some of the most famous parables of Jesus are completely misunderstood today because we are reading them through a Greek lens. Take the famous line, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." We've all heard it. We all imagine a giant camel trying to squeeze through a tiny sewing needle. It's absurd. It's impossible. But some linguists say that in Aramaic, the word for rope, gamla, and the word for camel, gamla, are almost identical. It depends on the accent or the spelling. Maybe it was never about a camel, maybe it was a rope. Think about that image, a thick rope trying to thread through a needle. It's hard, it's frustrating. You have to unwind the rope, strip it down to a single thread. That makes sense. A rope fits in a needle just barely if you strip away the excess. A camel does not. If this old Syriac text confirms the rope translation, it changes the meaning. It shifts it from impossible to difficult, but requires stripping away your wealth. These lost texts could correct 2,000 years of bad translations. We might find out we've been following instructions based on a typo. But here is the wildest theory of them all, the Q source. Biblical scholars have a theory called the Q source. They notice that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke have a ton of identical material that isn't in Mark. They believe Matthew and Luke were copying from an older secret document that we have never found. They call this lost document Q from the German word Quell, meaning source. For centuries, Q has been a ghost, a myth. What if the old Syriac text is the Q source? What if Grigory Kessel didn't just find a translation? What if he found the blueprint? If this is Q, it predates everything. It predates the church structure. It predates the Vatican. It takes us back to the raw, unedited sayings of the teacher before the editors got involved. And if that is true, it might contain the secret sayings. The Gospel of Thomas, another controversial text, starts by saying, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." That is a bold claim. The church rejected Thomas. But what if the old Syriac text contains similar secret codes? Some researchers look at the structure of the Aramaic letters themselves. They believe in gematria, a code where letters equal numbers. What if the text isn't just a story, but a mathematical formula? What if the specific word choice in Syriac holds a numerical value that points to a date? Which brings us to the resurrection timeline. What if the old Syriac gospel holds the true dates of the crucifixion? There have always been debates about the exact year and day. Was it a Wednesday? A Friday? The Roman calendar and the Jewish calendar don't always line up. If this text aligns with the Jewish calendar in a way that the Roman calendar ignored, it could shift our understanding of Easter. We are talking about shifting the bedrock of the liturgical year. Imagine telling the Pope, "Hey, you've been celebrating Easter on the wrong day for 1,700 years." That is a PR nightmare. That is the kind of information an institution would want to keep erased. And then there is the danger of the ending. The crazy part is that we have only deciphered a fraction of this manuscript. Kessel found one chapter. One. There are pages and pages left to scan. Who knows what is in chapter 13 or chapter 20? We might find that the ending of Matthew is different. We know for a fact that the earliest version of the Gospel of Mark ends abruptly. It ends at Mark 16:8 with the women fleeing the tomb in fear and no appearance of the risen Jesus. That's it. Fade to black. Later scribes, hundreds of years later, added the ending we know today where Jesus appears to the disciples. They added it because the cliffhanger was too scary. Does this old Syriac Matthew have a different ending? Does it include the Great Commission? You know the verse, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." This verse is the engine of history. It is the verse that launched missionaries. It is the verse that justified the Crusades. It is the verse that justified colonization. Go out and conquer the world for the faith. But what if that verse isn't in the old Syriac text? What if the original instruction was simply, go back to Galilee and live in peace? If the Great Commission is a later addition inserted by a Roman emperor who wanted to expand his territory using religion, then the entire justification for global expansion collapses. That is why this is dangerous. That is why people are watching this blue light scan so closely. History is a tower of cards, and Grigory Kessel just pulled one out from the bottom. The whole tower is shaking. So, do you think this lost gospel is just a recycled scrap of paper, or did the church hide it on purpose to cover up a different version of history? And if we keep scanning, will we find something that breaks the internet? Let me know your wild theories in the comments. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more mysteries revealed.